What's up guys, welcome back. This is kind of a historic video for me. It's going to mark my first time painting a Kingdom Death model. It's a pretty cool miniature, but I found it weirdly challenging to paint. It's quite blocky and sparse on the detail front, so I found myself having to add a lot more extra elements to flesh it out a bit. Speaking of flesh, for the skin I started off by mixing some Games Workshop Screamer Pink into some Fantasy & Games Resurrection Flesh. Then I added a touch of Scale Colour Graphene Grey just to dull it down slightly. Careful you don't add too much of that or it's going to end up looking quite muddy. Alright, so we'll use that as our base colour, and you can see that it's actually pretty transparent, so I had to paint this on over a few layers. I think it was about 3 or so until I got it opaque. For the first highlight, I'll mix a bit of Scale Colour Light Skin into the base tone, and we want the consistency to be pretty thin for this. We're not quite in glaze territory, but it should be thin enough that it's going to be transparent, but not so thin that it loses elasticity. That's because we need to have a fair amount of control over where the paint is going, especially when you're painting the face. Okay, so I'm using quite a standard layering technique here, just pushing the paint over the surface up to where I want the highlight. So I'm drawing the brush up over the cheek and lifting it when I reach the underside of the eye. Generally more pigment is left on the model at the point where you lift the brush, so it's usually a good practice to move the bristles in the direction of your highlight. It's pulling slightly too much on the right side there, so I'll use a second clean brush and just use the bristles to draw that off the surface so that it doesn't dry all kind of funny. Yep, that looks decent. We'll do the same again now here, pulling the paint across the surface towards the tip of the chin, and again on the upper lip, on the nose, and we'll do the other side as well. Later on we're going to be making this half of the face quite dark because it's going to be covered by a hat, so I'm just doing this in order that you get another look at the highlighting process. It's important when you're doing this that you resist the urge to go back and mess with the paint after you lift the brush. You want to minimise the amount of time spent moving the paint so that you don't interrupt the drying process. If you start fussing about with it, you run the risk of ripping the paint as it dries, and that's going to give you an uneven surface, making it almost impossible to get a smooth finish. Alright, so we'll do that again with the same colour, just applying another layer on top. This helps to ensure that our highlight is nice and strong. We don't want the paint to be transparent at the highlight, so adding a second layer, the same colour, reinforces the highlight and stops us getting that washed out look. Mix a little more light skin into your paint. Now you're going to find that adding the paint will thicken the consistency, so make sure to check if you need to add any water to maintain that thin layer quality to the paint. Much like before, we're going to push the paint over the surface of the skin towards where we want the highlights. So under the eyes and towards the centre of the face. And by that I mean the tip of the chin, the middle of the upper lip, and the end of the nose. If ever you place the paint and it looks like it's too opaque at the edge, just quickly grab a second clean brush and use the tip of the bristles to pull the edge of the paint away to the side. If you're fast enough at getting the brush, it should still be wet enough for you to manipulate the edge without it messing up your paint job. Usually I have a second brush held between my lips so that I can grab it and fix any little mistakes as I go. I should have done it there under the eye too, that was a mistake, but I can show you a technique to fix that later. You can see that the highlight under the eye doesn't really have that much of a transition now. But if we take that same paint with hardly any on the brush, we can place a few little dots just around the edge of the highlight, and if we do that in a couple of layers we should be able to blur out that hard edge. You could also use a glaze, but I quite like to use a bit of subtle stippling on skin because it gives you a slightly less smooth finish, which I think gives you a more natural appearance to skin. For the last highlight we'll use light skin on its own, again keeping the consistency fairly thin, and we're going to apply it to the usual spots. So the tip of the chin, the middle of the upper lip, and just underneath the eye. Now that we're essentially done with the highlights, we're going to fill in some of the details. Mix a little bright red into your base colour. I'm using Fantasy & Games Ball Crimson because it's really nice and vibrant, and we'll use that to paint the bottom lip. You can see that I'm using quite a big brush for all this. That's so that the paint stays wet on the bristles, so that I don't have to rush between getting the paint off the palette and putting it on the model. As long as it is a good tip, you should be able to paint small details without swapping to a smaller brush size. Alright, so now we're going to take some scale colour black leather, which is a pretty dark purple colour, and we'll add a bit of water to it to make a glaze. Then with a small amount on brush, I'm going to glaze this over the left side of the face, and I'm going to do this over a few layers, letting the glaze dry each time. So this is going to darken down that side quite a bit. As I alluded to earlier, the reason for this is that the model is going to be wearing a hat and the peak of it comes down over that side of the face, which should put it in a shadow. So we want to darken it down in order to have the colour make sense when we put the hat on. So there you can see that now that we've got the hat on, just how much of the face is actually going to be covered up. To continue, we'll take some more of that black leather, but with a thicker consistency this time, and we'll block in the eye sockets. You might find it easier to do if you hold the model on its side like this. It's usually less awkward to get the shape right from this angle. For the eyeball itself, we'll use some Vallejo ivory. When I'm doing this, I try to target the left side of the eye and draw the brush to the right as if I was painting a line. You don't have to get it right in one go. I usually mess about here for a while trying to get the shape right. Just try to maintain that dark outline around the eye. That's the most important thing. For the iris, I used some scale colour boreal green and I mixed in a small amount of black just to darken it slightly. Usually I have the eye looking off to the side, but on this one I went for more of a straight ahead look. When you're doing this, try to paint it so that the iris covers the whole of the middle part of the white. So by that I mean that you don't want to have a white outline around it because that's going to give you that creepy 1,000-yard stare look and you really want to try and avoid that. So just try to have it touch the top and bottom edges of the white. I also went in off cam with some ivory and added a tiny highlight onto the iris. So it was so small that I had to do that off cam so that I could see what I was doing because I had to have it really close to my face. It's not 100% necessary to do that, but it does add a little bit of extra detail in there. I'll just put the hat on now to give you a better idea of how it's going to look. It's a little hard to see without the surrounding areas being blocked in, but I can tell that the lip needs to be more prominent, so I'll take some of that Bal Crimson on its own and just apply it to the lip to bump the colour up a bit. Then if we mix some ivory into the red, we'll get a nice pink and we'll use that to add a very small highlight. When I'm doing these tiny highlights, I often rotate the brush, looking at the very tip of the bristles to try and find where the sharpest point is. Then I gently touch it against the lip and hopefully we leave just a little dot of colour on there. Alright, so that's the face pretty much done. We will go back later and add some more colour to the cheek, but for now it's more than fine. For the rest of the skin, we're going to use the same highlight tones we used on the face. For the chest, we're going to pull the paint down over the surface. There will be more light hitting the skin on the chest the further away we get from the face. And you want to try to use the transparent nature of the paint to create your transitions. I'm not really using any kind of fancy technique here, I'm just pulling the paint over the surface to where I want the highlights. It's okay if it's rough for a few layers, we can always tidy it up later with some glazes. So each time I go back to work on an area, I try to increase the brightness of the colour slightly, and I keep the paint thin and I do my best to move the paint around as little as possible so that I don't overwork it. I just try to push it into position and then leave it. Again, you want to try and resist the urge to fart about with it. If you want a smooth result, the less time your brush is on the model, the better. If you get into the habit of continually moving the paint around on the surface, it will begin to dry while you're moving it about, and that results in little balls of dried paint forming on your model, and they can be really annoying to remove. On the chest here, I'm just trying to pull the paint down on either side to help form the shape of the breasts, leaving a bit of a hollow in the centre. Once I've built up the brightness of the highlight, I'll often use stippling to give a bit of subtle texture to the skin, and also to help blend out any areas where the paint hasn't gone on smooth as I'd like it. When you're doing this, you essentially want it to be a medium glaze consistency, and with a small amount of paint on the brush, you're going to look over the surface for any little inconsistencies in the blend, and then just apply some dots of the glaze over those spots to help blend them out. I also apply them more generally over the strongest part of the highlight just to give the surface a bit of texture. Skin is really perfectly smooth, so it's nice to add a bit of stippling to help bump up the realism. Now that we've built up the highlight, I'll add a subtle shadow to the middle of the chest. For that we'll use some scale colour black leather, which will thin down to a glaze consistency with a bit of water. Then with a small amount on the brush, I'll glaze down between the breasts, just where the chest meets the cloth of the jacket. I'm not going to go crazy here, I'll only do a few glazes, I don't want it to be all that dark. Alright, so that's the chest basically done now. Much like the face, we will revisit this later once we've blocked in some of the other areas, but for now we'll just finish off the legs. Generally, we want to try and match the shape of the highlight to the shape of the surface that we're working on. So if you look at the legs, you can see that they are slightly tapered cylinders, a bit like a carrot or a parsnip. When you're building up your highlight, try to be mindful of that shape and just push the paint over the surface so that it conforms to the contours of the leg. So I just build up that highlight on the front of the legs over a couple of layers with that first highlight tone. You can see that the paint I'm using is really quite thin and transparent. That lets us build up a smooth transition quite naturally without a lot of going back and forth with glazes. On the back we'll do a similar sort of thing, matching the highlight to the shape of the legs. For now we're just putting in a general highlight over the whole of the leg, but when we finish the highlight will be strongest at the top of the leg and also at the centre of the cheeks. And I'll do another layer with that same colour. Because we're using quite thin layers, we want to do a couple of applications before trying to increase the brightness. That way we ensure the paint is going to be opaque at the highlight, so notice that I'm pulling the paint up from one side of the leg, stopping around the middle, and then I pull it up over the other side, again stopping around the middle. I do this fairly quickly and just let the wet paint coalesce at the middle point of the leg. Again, it's important that you resist the urge to go back and mess with the paint. You just want to pull the paint into position and then leave it to dry. I think we could do with another layer of paint, so I'll do the same again, just pulling the paint up one side of the leg and then pulling up the other side so that it meets in the middle. Also notice that I'm making the highlight a little wider at the top of the leg. Remember that we're trying to match the highlight to the shape of the surface that we're working on, so because it's wider at the top, we want our highlight to match that. On the back we'll do the same again, applying another layer of that same highlight colour, just to make sure that the paint at the strongest points is nice and solid. We'll move on to our second highlight now, taking some of that slightly brighter mix we used on the face. Again, keeping it quite thin. We're going to apply it in the same way as before, pulling it to one side and then the other. We also want the highlight to be a little brighter at the top of the calf muscles, so we'll pull the paint onto those two areas as well. This is because the surface goes from concave to convex, so the light would be hitting that area as it begins to curve upwards. So we'll go back with that same colour and do another layer. So there is faster ways to do this, but I'm just trying to show different approaches for things throughout the videos. I think that way you'll get exposed to a wider array of techniques, and hopefully that'll allow you to see that you don't have to get trapped into a certain way of painting something. Hopefully you find that more useful than just sticking to the same method every time. So we'll take a little brighter paint again and apply the highlights in the same sort of manner, focusing more towards the top and middle of the leg this time, and the same on the back. And then we're going to apply a second layer of that highlight. So each time I take a slightly brighter paint from the palette, I try and apply it thinly to the model over a couple of layers. I think you get the general idea now, so I'll speed this up a little until we get onto the next technique. So you just want to keep applying thin layers, taking slightly brighter colours each time until you get close to using pure light skin. So now that we've built up the colour a little bit, we're going to take some of that scale colour light skin on its own, and using that same thin consistency we'll go back and add some final highlights while adding a subtle texture to the surface. So what I'm doing here is applying little small dots over the surface. I'm going to do these mostly at the top of the leg where the highlight will be the strongest, but also over the rest of the leg to a lesser extent. So because the paint is quite thin, these fade out as they dry and they leave you with quite a subtle effect, but when you apply them over a few layers the paint gets more and more opaque. So you want to do the dots fairly sparsely the further away from the highlight you get, and then cluster the dots in a tighter grouping around the highlight at the top of the leg. Like I said before, skin is never perfectly smooth, so adding these subtle little dots helps you to develop quite a natural look to the skin. It's really important when you're doing this that you keep the paint and thin so that your dots fade out when they're applied. If they go on thickly, it will end up looking really bad. I think you get the general idea now, so I'll speed this up a little until we get onto the next technique. So you can see the skin is starting to look quite natural now. On the back, I'll just make that highlight at the top of the leg, underneath the butt cheeks, a little bit brighter. I realised at this point that I wanted to add some more depth to it, so to do that we'll add some water to some scale colour black leather, thinning it down to a glaze consistency. And we're going to glaze this up here between the legs, and then use a second clean damp brush to draw the edge of the glaze away to the sides, so this stops you getting any kind of staining on the surface. We'll do the same sort of thing on the other side here, pulling the glaze down to the bottom, then using a second brush to feather the edge of the glaze. And again on the other leg, and we'll just do this over a few layers, building up the shadow. We'll do the same sort of thing on the chest as well, this time pushing it up towards the neckline, using that second brush to draw the glaze away in the opposite direction. So that's just to make sure that you don't get any coffee staining on the glaze when it dries. I'll also put a little on the bottom of the face too, just to give it a bit more shape. To finish the face off, we're going to use a scale colour red ink, and we're going to thin that down with some water. Now I said this a few times, but when you're working with inks, make sure to thin it down with more water than you think you'll need to. Inks tend to be really strong even when you thin them, and you can ruin a good paint job really quickly if you don't thin them enough. So with a small amount of the ink on the brush, I'll glaze around the cheek area of the model to give it more of a rosy glow. I want it to be fairly subtle, so I'm not going to go crazy with it, just a few applications should do. I'll also glaze the ink down over the chest to give it a bit more colour. So yeah, I think that looks pretty nice now. It's a little more interesting than before. I'm not sure how well it shows up on the video, but in real life it's much more obvious. Alright guys, so that is another way to approach painting skin. I covered quite a lot of techniques in the video, so I hope you found it useful. If you have a question or you just want to let me know what you thought, drop a comment down below and I'll get back to you. I usually read every comment and it's always interesting to see what you have to say. If you want to check out how I painted the rest of the model, the full 2.5 hour video can be accessed through my Patreon feed for as little as $1. Alright guys, so I think that's all from me. Thanks again. Bye for now.